Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 9 of the On the Couch podcast, where we talk about On the Couch and all the cool ideas behind it, the thoughts behind all of its principles. Now, today, we're going to be talking about truth in roleplay and where the responsibility lies within it, within the style, and the effects of the choices one way or another. But that being said, let's go ahead and introduce first who we are to some degree.
Hi, I'm Cylon. I like doing roleplay stuff and stories of all forms, I suppose. I've been in VR chat roleplay for around 3 years now and have participated in some roleplays, have run some roleplays, and now we're here on a podcast. Though I will posit to the audience here. It's like today, am I the Cylon who tells the truth, or am I the Cylon who lies? That is the question. We shall find out.
Oh no, I'm not prepared. I'm not prepared to figure this one
I
out.
wonder which one of us came to today's episode.
All right, that's everyone else's focus. I'm gonna sit here and be bewildered at whatever the answer is. That being said, I'm Solus. I also enjoy roleplay, and I enjoy talking about roleplay. And we are here on this football field to talk about this fun little principle that kind of pans over the collaborative effort that we all experience within roleplay to share a sort of truth within a setting and what that means and how we can make decisions around that. I have done very little introducing of myself. I've been a role player for 4 years in VR. That's my thing. I have a cat that yells at me sometimes. She has decided to actually come in today. What else do I usually say about myself? I enjoy roleplay. I talk about roleplay. Yeah, that's basically it. I'll just leave it at that. Okay. So, how about we dive right into it then, shall we?
Sure. Suppose we can just remind our lovely audience that if they have any questions at any time, they may absolutely interrupt us and ask away. I think we're both kind of looking at the respective chats, but aside from that, number 9, truth is a shared responsibility. Let's go.
All right. So, when we think about truth in roleplay, what is the first thing we think about, right? So things that we know to be true within a setting, whether they've been talked about, written, established by some interaction implied, whatever, it is the collection of things that are real, that you know for a fact are real within a setting. And we can kind of pull from one of our earlier discussions in one of our last episodes with talking about how truth gets established, right? We talked about yes-anding and other techniques to establish truth within scenes. That also plays a very significant role, right? Because these sorts of truths that get established between players are also a big part of that. And this, at its very core, this principle is made to kind of have us lean into that sort of storytelling, that sort of truth building that push a lot of that more onto the players. Now, when we look at one of the biggest inspirations for roleplay, normally we end up looking at sort of the tabletop inspirations. And we can kind of look at we can do a little compare and contrast, right? In the live action format, the things tend to work very differently. But let's look at the tabletop, right? We have, generally speaking, we have very turn based sort of actions. We have the stop and go. We have the measure response, action response kind of format, and then on top of that, we also have this sort of separation, right? That the GM tends to sit at the head of the table and is the arbiter of all the things that happen within it. So what that also means is they have a rule set to abide to. They also decide everything that happens and the outcomes of the things that happen. So the GM, in the tabletop sense, is very much the arbiter of this truth. And what we're aiming for is to kind of pull away from that quite a bit with real time, because that dependency on leaning into that arbiter of truth, more times than not, slows things down. Right, when we think of speed and we think of the GM.
I think the first question that like I would have, for us to discuss, and I think it's kind of like the theme of today is today is kind of like the why. It's kind of, but why?
Mm-hmm.
Next week we're talking about what is real, what is true. That's going to be next week, but this week is kind of like, why are things real in roleplay? What makes something real to the story? What makes it true?
Mm.
It's like, why is something true in a roleplay? And in a tabletop game, very often, why is something true? What makes it true? GM said so very very often. And yeah, and honestly, I think for certain tabletop games that does work, and actually we can kind of explore the why. Why is it that way? Why do we do that? Or why do we not do that?
Right. I think, like, if we want to explore from the tabletop perspective, I think it's because of the. Oh, that's actually a good question. Like what? Well, the comparison we usually draw is 10 candles, right? Because 10 candles is very much the like exception to almost everything we posit. In that, like in this case, 10 candles, it gives a lot of narrative control to the players, and in fact, 10 candles revolves around mechanics involving narrative control using the dice. So there's this very clear and deliberate push of responsibility of the narrative and the truth of the narrative to everyone around the table, which very much follows this principle in its core.
10 Candles does call itself shared storytelling, though, so I suppose that is usually a bit different than what people think on tabletop. I guess you have kind of already brought up the first point. I think you've mentioned speed, but to connect it to like tabletop, I've played some D&D. It hasn't been like too much, but one thing that I learned in my time playing Dungeons and Dragons is there's this principle that you never split the party. And there are two reasons for this. The first one is the less relevant for today, is like the game isn't balanced around splitting the party. But that one's actually less relevant for today. The other reason you don't split the party in a Dungeons and Dragons game, because it's gonna take forever. Like,
Yep.
you're gonna sit there and you're gonna have to wait for the one person who goes off on their adventure. You're gonna wait like an hour before it's everyone else's turn again.
Right.
So yeah, let's talk about that.
Sure. Like D&D, and we're doing the compare and contrast here, right? D&D is built in such a way that you can't do two things at once. VR roleplay, being a real-time format in a large environment, functions very differently, so we'll talk about that for sure. But D&D has this funky bit about it where it, if you split your party, then you have to kind of flip back and forth in between these different scenes, and that affects the runtime. It affects the speed at which you can do things. And if we think about like maximizing how much we actually do within the space, that comes down very much to maximizing the time that we're actually spending doing interesting things. And if you are spending half the time not doing anything, obviously that's not great. So um, this definitely helps kind of kick off that sort of mentality of like, how do I actually uh, push more of the active time of this specific time window that I'm spent role playing to actually be doing role play that I enjoy. In the D&D sense, that would usually mean don't split the party is one of those ways that you would avoid that, because then with everyone in the same space, everything that happens is relevant to you directly because you are involved in the scene that the thing is happening in. And today we're talking about something that kind of helps that in VR roleplay, right? Because something that we just went over earlier is the GM, right? GM the GM in VR roleplay, despite having all of the tools to move and decide as fast as possible, is still the slowest thing in a roleplay. Because whenever they talk, everyone else has to listen. The GM speaking in a scene is effectively pausing the roleplay regardless of what is going on around them, because something has to be processed in that moment for something to be affected. So already from like the speaking perspective, if you are relying on the GM to arbiter to be an arbiter of truth in a scenario, then you're automatically inserting some of that removal of roleplay into the scenario that you're looking for that truth from. So in reality, if we are kind of following the same mental pattern of seeking to efficiently process how we do roleplay and to maximize how much roleplay we're doing that we enjoy, then that would be one of the dependencies that we look at and say, how do we mend this in some way? How do we make this better?
I think I've first I'll talk about before talking about how to make it better. I think I have at least a little bit of a hand in like not everywhere, but just a little bit of a hand in like making it worse a bit. Like, um,
Oh,
I guess last week we talked about you and the kind of the dice prefab. This week we can mention me and the lovely GM ping system. Um,
yeah.
it almost feels like it almost feels like a bit of like induced demand in the role plays that use it. The idea, okay, so um, the idea was right. Kind of the idea is that uh, you have people that feel the need to call a GM into the scene, and they're going to like try to call for a GM, and that takes a long time, right? The idea was that, well, maybe if we can speed up the process of calling a GM into a scene, then like they'll spend less time waiting, and then the people around them are going to spend less time waiting, and that will kind of like streamline the process. And this was kind of like one of the core ideas behind the or one of the core motivations that I made this menu that allows GMs to kind of fly around the map. But more relevant to today, it allows players to call for GMs. It allows player to click a button and be like, "Hey, GM, I need you." It puts you into like a priority queue so the GMs can kind of go on a first come first serve basis. Um, and like this definitely does speed up response time. However, kind of from the role plays that I've kind of looked at, like role plays that do and kind of don't use the system, I feel like there may be even like a little bit of like an induced demand going on where like it's easier to call for a GM, therefore you do it more often. And
Hmm.
so any time that you would have saved by responses being shortened is lost by people calling for GMs more.
Right.
Um, right?
So
So I will fit induced demand into into today's conversation. But that's kind of like what that feels like. Where like it almost feels like attempting to shorten like response times to me does not feel like the correct way to go about it, because making something more convenient generally makes people do it more. Uh, and that's I guess maybe my regret when design the thing that I most regret when designing the GM menu. I still fully stand by almost all of the features on there, except that I think that the ping system should have been less convenient, uh, in my opinion, because like I purposefully made the whispering less convenient. Like I foresaw that one as like a problem, so like I purposefully made that like not as convenient as it could be, kind of to make people consider not using it. But the pings kind of passed over my head essentially, and that feels like the incorrect way to solve that problem.
That's like a hard thing to balance, though, right? Because it's like, sure, in the end, the things that you design to be easier will be used more often, or will be like communicated as things that can be used more often. But at the same time, um, it is one of those things that can be valid in some circumstances, and how to find that and strike that balance of when it makes sense for a GM to be present for something versus like, can I climb this tree? And then the response usually being, I don't know, can you? is one of those things. I didn't take the I didn't explain fully last time we talked about the dice prefab though. So I will this time just for the sake of completeness. The dice prefab, while not completely my invention, I will say I built off of Sketchu's original dice prefab stuff. So I don't want to take full credit. Not for the sake of like what it caused, but like the actual functionality itself. Sketchu did a great job with that prefab. What I did was effectively made it work a little bit differently. Gave it a setup to actually be, placed on an avatar and to be rolled the full 1 to 20 with a little like flipping of values in between. So that's what I did. And if you ever see on anyone's stream or anyone's like GM avatar the like flip through values for half a second, land on one dice prefab with the kind of like pixelated sort of dice with different colors, that's the one. And it's almost everywhere. And there's the induced demand thing is very, very real when it comes to that as well. Um,
So yeah, it's the case. I suppose I also did not come up with the idea of having a GM menu. I just made it drag and droppable into your Unity project.
mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's like if you make something easy enough, it doesn't have to be the best. If it's easy enough to use, um,
Or
that, that
original, I
that's kind of
guess.
yeah.
It's like figuring out ways to do things faster. I guess it depends on what we're looking at, right? Uh,
Mhm.
so looking back at the whole aspect of truth now. So let's get back to
Yeah.
the
I
topic,
will
right?
I will to segue onto the topic. I will parrot, I suppose, in induced demand our arguments here.
Sure.
Uh, so reducing or sorry reducing kind of attempting to reduce the overhead of kind of GM scenes will cause people to use it more, thereby offsetting any gains that you would have made. Um, and that's kind of like, if we take a step back, right? The the problem here, I don't necessarily think with GM, it isn't necessarily that like it's slow. It's that when a GM shows up to a scene, it puts everything on pause, right? And so if you want less of that, then the actual solution is, instead of like trying to make the GM scene faster, which will never eliminate the problem, instead of trying to make a GM scene faster, you need viable alternatives to having GM scenes, right? Reserve the GMs for like when it's actually absolutely necessary, which more often than not, it probably isn't, right? If you're thinking of, oh shoot, it's absolutely necessary that I have a GM, probably not. It's probably not absolutely necessary. But having viable alternatives, other things that you can do that aren't as slow and cumbersome, right, will make your roleplay go faster and flow smoother.
Right. So the approach that we kind of recommend, at least to tackle this very specific scenario, is decentralizing that source of truth, putting more of that responsibility into the hands of the players. So that way, you basically arm these players with the knowledge of what the world is and what they can decide around, being a lot larger of a breadth of information, and kind of not necessarily asking for people to go through this sort of gateway check to make things real within the world. Uh, this sort of leads to this decentralized sense of truth, which is very fast, right? Because at this point, players can effectively manifest things very much like we talked about before with improv, um, by just talking about them and creating these sorts of realities within our settings. But what that also does is it leads to that extra bit of responsibility for the players, and it leads to the worries and questions that come with it, right? How do we make sure that all of this is consistent? And that's something we can talk about in a bit later. But it introduces challenges, but it also introduces a solution, which is the solution that we are aiming for.
Like if you're ever in the situation where it's like, oh, your GM team is swamped, right? They're like constantly answering questions that players have. Well, if you allow, if you allow your players to kind of like just answer their own questions, well, now it's almost as if you have every single person in the role play is like now, now the labor is divided evenly across everyone in the role play, and you no longer have to wait for this like first you no longer have to wait this for this limited resource, right? You no longer have to have this like large staff of GMs to accommodate all the players, but also you no longer have to pause scenes in the first place um, if you allow your players to kind of make their own truth.
Right. And that means you get to not be swamped as a GM, right? I'm planning to run Legacy as one GM with X amount of players, no matter how many players there are. Right. This is something I'm absolutely planning to do. So I am very willing to take on that workload because I understand that workload for me, what I want to incentivize, is going to be a lot less than what is more kind of core standard for a lot of the role plays today. That being said, I'm trying to like brainstorm currently, like what kind of ways can we do that, like as roleplay leads, right? How do we? Because I know I have seen absolutely some attempts to do this or to do similar, where there have been attempts to encourage players to make their own decisions and to decide how things will go. And then like I have also seen maybe half the time that gets not pushed across the line very well, and I'm wondering like what kind of ways are there to help establish that. What do you think?
Encourage people. Um,
Yeah.
See that's a tough one because I think that's like a cultural thing. I think that's kind of falls into like the category of kind of like building a role play culture. Um,
Hmm.
like first things first. For example, like if I ever did a role play again, or like host a role play again, I'd probably still use my GM menu. I'd like remove every ping button, like except the emergency one. Uh, that's like probably like that would be like an easily enactable change, and probably people would use the emergency button to ask like, like, hey GM, what should I do in this situation? And then it's kind of like up to you as the GM to like kind of not entertain those and kind of make it clear kind of what's what like the responsibility is here. And of course, like there is kind of room for help, right? There is room for helping players in this situation, but the help looks different, right? Help takes on a different form where you're helping people help themselves rather than helping people directly. Um,
Mhm.
so I think a lot of the stuff that we've talked about in earlier episodes kind of still apply. Like you would probably have like this, clear communication of like, well, here's what you need to know, here's what you don't need to know. Like clear communication, ways to kind of like access that information, um, and but at some point, right? At some point, like it is the player's responsibility. So like we can like as staff or as organizers, like we can help people, but I guess that's I think the big thing here is that if you make truth a decentralized thing, that is a shift in responsibility. Um, and so it's actually would be, I think, counterproductive to expect that it be on the organizers to make this change or entirely, right?
Right.
To expect that it be entirely on the shoulders of the organizers to make this sort of change is, I think, a bit counterproductive because that's the whole point of the change is that, well, now players have more power, but they also have more responsibility with that power. So you can't like, you know, um, you can't remove that responsibility part.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of like how it starts, right? How do you get to that point? Uh I am thinking it kind of there is like the outset, the first impression of like what exactly players are responsible for and just kind of laying that out. And I think like the more we start to have players apply as players, I think that ultimately has a really big impact. I think like I think Worlds Apart actually had a really had a really you could speak more on it as having been the person that responded to a lot of the players more or less. But I thought that at the very least the application process was a kind of big contributing factor to establishing this sort of mindset of like, oh, I'm here as a player, not as a thing in the world, and that means I am responsible for this kind of mindset that we're aiming for. I don't know. You could speak out more on that probably.
Um, I was throwing an idea around in my head here. Like, I just thought of this, so I will just voice it and we can see what you think.
Okay.
Um, because this is a thing that I've kind of been annoyed about, and it kind of makes sense in this context. I feel like a big thing is kind of like a change in the relationship that you as like organizational staff, like a change in the relationship of how you treat your lore would go would benefit a lot. Um, I've seen a lot of projects and kind of a lot of like role plays feel like the lore is almost being like treated as like a world building project where like you have these like things that exist in the world, right? And the world is its like own big thing. You kind of like zoom in on aspects of the world. Um, it's like these things are in the world, right? The lore is a list of things that like these things are in the world. And like um I feel like that, that kind of relationship with your lore kind of leads it to feel like, well, here's like an authoritative top down, and also like this is what exists in the world, right? That this is what exists. And what I think is much more productive for role plays is to treat the lore as like a guideline, right? Rather than a list, right? You treat it more as like a guideline of these are the things that could exist in this world, right? Where it's like rather than a like a rather than having like a dictionary, right? You kind of have a map of things,
Okay.
and you can kind of like pick your own direction to go off in. And here's where I'm going to mention themes. Themes definitely help, right? Um, if your players have the ability to kind of just like look at something, squint at it, and be like, "Yup, that fits. Yup, that fits in this world," then like that would certainly help a lot, right? Having strong themes that are going to kind of tell you whether or not the thing that you're thinking in your mind fits or doesn't fit, right? Like very distinctively is going to help a lot. Obviously, the gray areas will always exist, but like having clearly defined, non-gray areas of like, well, the bigger your non-gray areas are, kind of the better. Um,
Yeah. Actually, I'm getting the vibe that like the easier it is for a player to make sense of the information they're parsing while being able to make sense of it in their own way helps push that sort of building collaborative process, right? Because if, like you said, if you do treat the lore as this sort of enumerative list of the things that exist, then there is no room to build in the cracks, right? There's no space between. Um, there's no room for interpretation. It's just this is what exists. This is the history of this place. This is what I expect to see here, which on its own can be valuable, but isn't buildable, right? I guess like a way to potentially summarize that is to use the lore as it's interpreted as a world building device and not on its own. So like the interpretation of the lore should be a world building device and not just the whatever the lore is. Is that like
yeah,
sort of it?
I suppose it's a different relationship because so I guess it's not so much like the things that are in the lore, it's like the relationship with the lore that kind of organizational staff has, where like
Yeah.
where like the relationship usually is, and kind of what I see a lot in the VR roleplay space, and also like, I mean, when I did tabletop as well, is that um, staff, GMs, whoever, right? They're going to kind of add stuff to the lore slowly over time as like, here's cool new information about the world that we've come up with, right? Here's like this new information about this corner of the world, or here's this new information about this corner of the world. These sorts of things exist. Um, but none of that is conveying a message to your players, right? It's just like, here's this thing that, I was interested in, or here's this other thing that I was interested in, or here's this third thing that I was interested in, right? Um, and that's kind of slowly drip feeding lore is a much different relationship than kind of being in your mind like, what sort of things do I want to see, right? Kind of figuring out what sort of things you want to see in the role play ahead of time, and then creating lore that specifically conveys that, right? Like right from the get-go. And at that point, right, you won't really like need to like add stuff like that anymore because your players will do it for you, right? Like you won't need to drip feed information, slowly over time because like it should already be obvious what does and doesn't fit. Um, like that is kind of like what what I feel like. Rather than, knowing every single historical event or exactly how the cities work or exactly how the countries work, how the magic works, right? Um, Rather than knowing all these like, tiny details, instead you have an idea of like, this could work in this world, right? And then if you don't have an idea, then sure, you can maybe add that later, but like you should at least get the broad strokes. You should at least get the really big things out of the way at the very beginning. Um,
I think the
I
big thing that comes to mind is trust building. And it is really trusting in your players to build with you on that
of
journey,
course.
right? Because if you are kind of establishing the thematic framework and then building using that, then what you're effectively saying is I have a world, I have a very strong idea based on the themes that we've talked about, what the world should look like, but it's not all concrete. It doesn't all necessarily need to be this super set in stone. This is the reality, and you're going to deal with it. It can be an idea. It can be a set of ideas. It can be a framework, and then as us role players do, when we actually play it out, when we actually start going in there and playing as our characters, we'll have some sort of basis to work from, and then we'll build off of that with each other. And I think I think as a tool for creating that sort of culture, just using that sort of trust building by opening that space would actually help quite a bit.
Mhm.
I fully agree. That's I'm on board.
Yeah, I suppose we should probably move on to responsibility then. I've
Yeah,
kind of been avoiding it. Like, yeah, I mean, it's definitely like I suppose that's to summarize, I guess, my advice then. I think like if you're an organizer and you're like building your lore and like you came up with this cool new idea, kind of stop for a moment and consider what is this communicating to my players? Am I communicating anything to my players in the first place? Like, is that why I'm adding this? Or am I adding this because I think it's cool? I don't necessarily think it's wrong to add something because you think it's cool, but it's when your lore is a collection of things that you think is cool that you're going to end up with something that is entirely in your head and nobody else's. And that's why your players are going to have to ask you personally what is and isn't okay because they can't read your mind, right?
right,
If your lore is just a collection of the things that are in your head and you think are cool, then it's going to be really difficult for anyone else to parse that. Whereas if you've kind of like written your lore in a way that you are actively trying to explain your ideas to your players and you're like, okay, I'm this, historical battle or whatever relates to this ideology. And that's to say that, this sort of character or kind of this sort of idea works well in my role play, then that will communicate a more cohesive and total message to your players. Um, and hopefully, assuming that people read, assuming that
yeah,
hopefully will help your players kind of come up with these ideas. However, I did say, assuming that people can read, assuming that people can understand it, right? Um, at the end of the day, right, what we are talking about when we're saying this decentralized truth, we are talking about shifting responsibility onto the players. Um, it is inherent in this sort of truth as a shared responsibility. Under this idea, it is inherent that your players will kind of have to pick up some of that work. You'll no longer have like a single point of contact with one person doing everything with the lore. This involves GMs and staff kind of giving up a little bit of creative control over their projects and giving that to the players. And it also involves the players taking responsibility for their actions with what they're doing, right?
hmm
Suddenly, I didn't read, is kind of a bit less, it's less doable, because you're not going to be able to just ask the GM later, right? You're not going to have that information catered to you. Um, but yeah, I guess let's talk about a bit about responsibility and kind of like where this comes from. Kind of like how do we get here? How do we get to um, kind of like projects and kind of like the ownership of projects
Yeah.
being the way that they are.
Yeah. So I'll set kind of the groundwork here just to kind of like fill in the spaces with what we talked about before with this principle is that looking at the tabletop example, a big part of it is that the reason why it works the way it does is because of this notion that the GM is always right, which kind of drives this sort of arbiter of truth gateway check to make things real and to have outcomes for scenarios. That's what drives it. It's the GM is always right. That we find has been carried into the VR space in that by having the GM as this arbiter of truth, that is why we contend with those bits of interruptions and the dependency, the bottleneck to actually experience certain things when we have to sit there and ping for a GM to find something out or to have some sort of outcome for something. And when we talk about shifting some of that responsibility over to the players, we're talking about narrative responsibility. We're talking about who decides what happens and who decides what's real. And when we're talking about that, we're looking at this notion of the GM is always right, and we're saying we don't actually believe that because the narrative responsibility of being right can also fall upon the players, and it is possible then for the GM to be wrong in circumstances, which the way we see it opens up this space for players and GMs to work with each other more. And that is absolutely a goal that we are looking for to kind of open up that space of not just necessarily assuming that the GM side of things is always right and that there's this constant kind of overhead of the GM has this like kind of higher role, but in reality, the players and GMs are working together, right? There's this collaboration of how this world's being built that the GMs have a certain hand in, the players have a hand in as well. And when the players take those reins, it is now the players' responsibility as well to start introducing and enforcing and reinforcing truths within the setting. So now back to the question, right?
So,
How do we do that?
I will actually take a moment because I don't actually like, just like it's like I don't actually think that the system like in tabletop, I don't actually think it's a bad system. Um I think what has happened, right, is kind of like in the transition from tabletop to live action that kind of happened in VR roleplay. This system is like really not appropriate for live action.
Right.
It actually works really well in tabletop though.
Yep. Yep.
The GM can actually always be right in tabletop, and you know why? Because they actually know the GM in a tabletop game actually knows everything. They are practically omniscient because all the information that exists within the world is going to be in that single GM's, right, like lore binder, and also all the information kind of in the one scene, right? The one scene that everybody around the table gets to see, right? That's the other stuff, or that's the other information that's contained within the story of the world, right? Um, so the GM actually has total information in a tabletop game. And so, right, like if you have this arbiter of truth sort of role in your game, well, that's made possible by the fact that, well, the GM in a tabletop game actually knows everything. Right, they are actually the person that has all the information. In a VR roleplay, however, this goes out the window, right? Or any roleplay that has more than one scene going on at a time. And I suppose I've mentioned this concept quite a few times already, I think. But like here it comes back again. The moment you have more than one scene going on at a time, our GMs in VR can be in a lot of places, right? They can teleport around and fly around the map really quickly, but they still cannot be in more than one place at a time, right? Like, no matter what, you still can't be in more than one place at a time. If there's more than one scene going at a time, you can only watch one of those scenes at a time. Or if you're hopping back between the two scenes really quickly, well, you'll have big gaps in your knowledge. You'll you'll kind of not be getting the full picture. And because of this, right? Speaking from experience, having GM'd, right? Speaking from experience, I really do feel like the sort of invisible floating GM style, um, at a certain size of roleplay, and I feel like that size is literally there are two scenes going on at once. At a certain size of roleplay, you stop having this total knowledge of everything that's going on inside your roleplay. You're no longer informed about what's going on. And not only that, you're no longer informed about what's going on in a scene before you show up to it. Right? You're kind of, as a GM, you're constantly playing catch up to what's going on in your roleplay, what's going on in your scenes. You'll find out stuff way later than your players. And so it's kind of weird then to expect the GM to be this total arbiter of all truth when they don't even know what happened like 2 minutes ago, right? Um, yes, they might know what happened, 1,000 years ago in the world's lore, but they don't even know what happened 2 minutes ago in the scene just now, right? So like, it's really weird to expect that the GM have that sort of total kind of arbitrative arbitrative control.
Right.
Uh, and yeah, so in other words, I would like to defend the system in a tabletop game because it makes sense. It makes sense to have that sort of system when you have something
Totally.
that's small. But the moment you have live action, the moment you have separate rooms, you can this sort of like top down arbitrator role goes out the window, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. Because like this is something we can all see for ourselves, whether we are actually GMs within a project, and or we can watch any GM that streams their viewpoint in a project or records it and you look back on it, that you can see that a lot of the scramble of being a GM is keeping track of all the things that are happening and having the GMs like communicate that between each other. It is a lot because anytime I've noticed this looking back on some of those viewpoints that whenever something big happens, sometimes the GMs will be sitting there talking about like what led up to it and how certain things happened in the like half an hour to an hour leading up to that point, how certain things got in certain places or how certain people got certain things. And they're basically keeping track of like people's inventory, people's actions, people's whereabouts, and it goes far, right? And this is all very hard. This is all very difficult to keep track of from an organizational standpoint, especially when you have like 30, 40, 50 people in a project that it just seems like it's just too much to a certain degree. It seems at that
It's
point.
not even that because you can always kind of substitute too much by you could just say, well, have more GMs, right? But
Right.
often I find that like the GM in that case, like unless you're going to have a GM following every single player around, right? Even then, the GM themselves isn't in the scene. They're not kind of like they're not the person who's in the scene. They're not the person who's feeling the emotions of the characters. They don't know what's going on inside the player's head. So even if you had a staff with GMs following around individually, every single player, right? Like a personal GM for every single player, the GMs would still be in the worst position in the role play to make calls about what's going on in the scene because they're not in the scene,
Right.
right? Um,
What was that
and
like
now,
type of scene called in improv where we have everyone against the back to the wall watching the scene like a mono scene?
oh no. Uh, are you asking about the specific form? Because
Yeah,
the
yeah.
back line is a common technique in a lot of things.
Okay. Fair
Um,
enough.
so when you're referring to the backline, that's a common technique, and like usually that's how like improv performances work. Is like the improvisers who aren't playing characters aren't just, hanging around. They aren't just gone. They are sitting there intently and absorbing all the information that's going on in the scene currently. And because there's only one stage, every single person knows everything that happens in the whatever structure is being played.
Right.
Um,
I wanted to bring that up as like another compare contrast, right? Because with the back line, like in the perfect scenario, you have a back line, you have context by having watched everything that leads up to a point, and then you have all the context you need to be able to enter a scene and be like, all right, I know what's happening here, I know what the goal is of the scene, I know what the direction is, and I can kind of play into it, and I have a lot more confidence that the thing that I'm doing is in line with what other people think is going on. Um, the contrast is that we almost always don't have that in roleplay. The GMs are especially unequipped with this because they are often coming into scenarios as they are unfolding without having any context to lead up to it. But even as players, right, we are often unequipped by walking into things that we encounter that we need more than just the context we see to be able to understand how to interact with the thing, right? This is why this principle's here, is because we're looking for the ways to understand what it is that helps us get to that point where it is easier to to build upon the context that we have, the limited context that we have. Because again, multiple scenes going on means that we can exit one scene and then enter another, and that scene could be completely different, right? Like what one good example is looking at any, or I say one good example. There are many good examples of role plays that have the opportunity to host these sort of extremely tragic and emotional conversations within earshot of some of the most lighthearted, like miasmic shenanigans you could possibly imagine. Aether Chronicles is one of those, right? I a week or two ago watched this like really difficult, serious conversation happening in a building where the literal floor below them, people were just like laughing it away and just joking around, having fun. It's very possible to just have those scenes completely like juxtaposed to each other because they exist in the same space, and that could be true of basically any roleplay that allows some level of seriousness or levity to exist in the same place. So like how we accomplish that sort of filling in the gap, that like building upon the limited context we have, is the focus, right? How do we do that? I keep ending with a "how do we do that" sort of thought bubble. I
yeah,
realize
I,
that's
I suppose
not a
it
great
does
prompt.
help. Well, I guess here's step number one, right? Step number one is kind of take a deep breath, let go, and trust your players.
Mm-hmm.
That's step number one. It's before anything that can happen. You have to be able to trust your players to establish their own truth, right? You have to be able to trust them with the truth of the role play. You have to be able to trust them to come up with things. If you can't, right? If you cannot trust your players, if you're incapable of trusting your players to add kind of truth to the world of your role play, you are already violating the magic circle. You have already broken the magic circle, and well, the magic circle is necessary for you to have a role play. It's necessary for you to be able to work together and tell a story together. So if you are from the get-go as a staff going to be like, okay, well, I can't trust my players, and you're going to kind of put limitations on the players where it's like, okay, you have this world, is yours, except, and then you have this like big list of like, except you can't touch A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? you've kind of like already violated that trust, and that will make playing, right? That will make playing and having fun kind of difficult, right? You'll have like a weird relationship, right, between the players and the staff forming. Um, it's not entirely of collaboration. Um,
I'm actually going to fight this one. I'm actually going to fight this one, if that's all right with you.
go. I think I know how you're going to fight it,
Fair, fair, fair.
but go ahead. I think I know, and yeah, go ahead.
My fight on this is it depends on how you are establishing your magic circle and what rules you are placing upon it. Because it is an agreement, right? Magic circle is an agreement that you enter within a space under the social contract that doesn't necessarily include full collaboration on the true civil world. Right. And if it is like, for example, you are entering a theater production that the lines are already predetermined for you, and your magic circle is effectively when everyone's on the set, the whatever the thing is that they snap to say, take number 22 or whatever. They do that. You hear the noise, and then you have effectively entered the magic circle. You are now embodying something else, and that trust is not necessarily in you changing anything or deciding something, but it is in you uh, interpreting what's already there and then building upon it in a different capacity than true setting, but more so portrayal and embodiment, right? So that's where I would go with that.
Yeah. So actually, I entirely agree, and I was actually about to kind of like clarify my own statement because
Okay.
I felt like the part was kind of vague, where it's not. So I'm not like against. I'm not speaking against like putting limitations on your players. Like obviously, you have to put limitations, right? In fact, that's what we kind of start with, right? Is like you want to have strong themes, and you want to have strong guidelines of like you know, what you can and can't do, and what does and doesn't exist in the world, right?
Yeah.
That's not it. It's it's more so it kind of feels like a sort of anxiety when you require the players to have this like single point of contact where like anything that happens needs to go through the single point of contact to kind of screen it to make sure that it's okay. Um, like that's kind of like a level of um, it almost feels like anxiety, right?
Hmm.
And mistrust where it's not so where it's like yes I've made clear here's what does and doesn't fit in my world, but I'm not going to but I still need you to like prove to me every time that you understand it, and I'm never it's never going to be enough, right? You're going to have to ask me every time, even though I've told you here is what doesn't work, you still need to come to me every time.
Right.
um right. Now, obviously, if you are kind of you have this roleplay project that hasn't clearly communicated what doesn't work, maybe this is a bit of a different, you know, a different argument in that case. But here I'm speaking from the perspective of like a project where like you have the GM team has communicated like here are the themes of our roleplay. These are the sort of things. These are the sort of stories that we're going to be telling. Um, I don't think you need to screen every detail, right? Like you don't need to, um, so somebody comes up with like a world event and like starts passing it around. You don't need to screen every single thing if it like kind of fits into the themes of the world and fits into the themes of the character.
Right.
Um, right? Like it's kind of like what's the worst that can happen, right? Um, the that can happen is that you realize that somebody is malicious and then you can remove them from your project. That's kind of the um but yeah, I mean if you aren't willing to extend that trust, right? Or rather if you're kind of like all the way on the other end where like everything needs to go through the single point of contact, which is the GM team, um that's like the opposite of trust. in kind of in my perspective. That
So
is like,
go on.
yeah. So it's kind of like, a really extreme, and obviously, like the other extreme of being completely fit free form is probably too much for like that. That's hard as well, right? That has its own drawbacks, but like there's probably some happy medium somewhere between the two extremes.
Mhm. And like, I think I think it might be safe to say that the reason why this is a breach of the magic circle is the implicit or explicit agreement that the players have the opportunity to do everything. I think that kind of gets carried with a lot of VR roleplay in the live action format, is that because we have this infinite freedom, we have also the freedom to make things happen. And establishing a sort of gateway check with that exact same understanding already existing then kind of violates, but one violates the other effectively. I think that's
Because you have
where that
infinite
comes from.
freedom. It's like, that's the question. It's like, do you really have infinite freedom if you also have like infinite oversight, essentially?
Right.
Oversight on everything that you do. Um,
Yeah. So let's talk about that
that's
balance.
that's a good philosophical question there. Uh,
I guess so.
one that I one that I wanted to explore with a little short form scenario. Maybe we'll run that again.
And
Um,
I actually did explore it with Rowan. Smile. That was actually part of it. Um, But yeah, let's talk about that balance, because we've talked a lot about like the top down, right? We talked about what GMs do with the players. What about like players with the GMs, right? Like how do we change that direction? How do we re-envision how players work with the GMs? When we had Leo on the podcast a couple episodes ago, we talked about collaboration and what that should ultimately look like in the sense of upholding normalcy. I think the exact same consideration comes in here, in that the GMs are not necessarily just sitting in their own box, pushing considerations onto the players, and then the players have to deal with it. In this format, we are talking about the players and the GMs collaborating. So, with the players having that responsibility as well, players then kind of send up a lot more through the feed to the GMs and actually talk about various things and ideas to build upon what each other are doing, right? We have talked about the GM's role being the keeper of the theme, right? Which can mean any number of different things, but one thing that I think is very core to that is that the GM is organizing some sort of central plot engagement to evidence and to set up this thematic conflict that's supposed to exist within the setting that players will then engage with. That the way that players engage with it, then it's like you basically have the two separate ends that are like intertwining very much with each other, and that player to GM interaction should absolutely resemble that, right? So how I'm doing it again. I one way that we can do that, right, is instead of deferring to the GMs as a player, right? Instead of deferring to the GMs, pitch some ideas over, right? Like, what would you think if this happened? What would you think? Does this make sense to you? All right, and kind of put out some of those ideas forward. Not all of them might land necessarily, but having that back and forth and that conversation started is a really good way to to establish that you are looking to work together and not under someone else. I don't think either the GM or the player should work under each other. I think that collaborative structure is far more conducive to the collaborative environment that VR roleplay and live action tends to encourage.
so we've been talking about like GMs a whole lot, right? Kind of like GMs like in a vacuum, and also like the relationship between players and GMs. I'm gonna take a moment just to talk about like the player perspective here, because remember, truth here is a shared responsibility. It's kind of born equally under this understanding of other things. Let's I want to talk about just players for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
You've, I guess, reminded me a bit of like, the long form improv stuff that I've been doing. What can you do as a player to kind of like make make it easier? Because yeah, I mean, if you've been in these role plays where um if you've been in role plays where kind of the GMs are kind of at your beck and call, and like if you have a question, you can immediately just like call a GM and have it answered, right? Like, that this is like a bit more responsibility. So like, I totally understand if it seems kind of scary, but fortunately it's not that much, right? It's not like it's a lot of extra work. It's just a different focus. So it's not like you're doing more, right? It's not like you have to do more in a role play or outside of the role play. It's just your focus as a player has to be in like a slightly different place. And I think one piece that is kind of like really missing from a lot of these discussions is like, as a player, what's going on around you? Like, do you know kind of like what the characters around you are doing? Do you know what's kind of like happening in the world of the role play beyond, you know, your, beyond your character, and like what the plans that you have for your character? Um, that sort of information can help a lot. And it's not something that needs to be like researched or read in a lore book, or like, it's not something that you need to like interrogate people outside of session. It's just a matter of kind of like paying attention to the people around you, being interested in other people's characters, and kind of like trying to figure out what those people are going for, right? Kind of like feeling out what the role play is about. Um, if you kind of pick up on those things, right? If you're kind of paying attention to the people around you while you're role playing, then you will have there are going to be so many ideas. You won't have to worry about like getting something wrong that you're making up, because you won't have to make anything up, because all that information, right? All those ideas are already there. Like people, like other people in the role play already have so many things that they've already introduced. You don't need to make up something new. It's probably the thing that you're looking for is probably already there, and somebody else is probably already um, engaging with those themes, or similar themes to what you're engaging with, and you just kind of need to keep an eye out for that. um, so this is kind of like, yeah, so in that sense, right? Like, yes, it's very important to kind of keep up communication with your with the staff of the role play. That's a very important thing. It's probably a good idea to proactively kind of have the staff know what you're trying to do, rather than them playing catch up all the time. And that's generally a good thing. But also, um, I think kind of like going at it from a, I'm going to just pitch my ideas to the GMs and they are going to trust me with it, is still not sharing, right? That's still the same. It's still the same like hierarchy of like, you're it's like you're still originating information, and it's still going through the single point of contact, which is the GMs, and they're still going to like choose whether or not to okay it or not. um so what I think, what truth as a shared responsibility really means, is kind of enabling those player to player interactions. And in order to enable those player to player interactions, you'll have to um, Well, you'll have to pay attention to the people around you. That's basically kind of the big part, um, or a big part of it.
Yeah, I can definitely get behind that. I think the one word summary is listen, right?
Listen, yeah.
Yep.
That is one of the big principles that we have in improv. And oh boy, when you're doing a long form performance, um, gosh, like you have like an hour or even longer, right? Like 2 hour performance, and you're telling this continuous story, and everybody knows every detail of the story because you've all made it together, right? Kind of, and you're kind of like forced to remember everybody's relationship to everybody else, right? That can be hard. The good news is, in a role play, you don't have to, right? You don't have to remember everybody's relationship to everybody else because it's literally impossible because there is more than one scene, right? Um, Everybody suffers from that problem, right? Nobody in a role play can see the whole picture. That's why it's kind of good to help each other out. And you at least want to know the stuff that's happening to you and the people around you. And kind of the stuff that's happening in your vicinity. And that involves knowing more than just what's happening to your character in particular, right? That involves kind of going that one step beyond, right? It really is just kind of one step beyond, not just what's happening to my character and their immediate vicinity. It's like, well, what's happening in the immediate vicinity of my character, and I think really helps. Um, that extra awareness, I think, really helps.
So I want to build on this in a very strong way here. It only ever takes one person to make a scene feel sour, perhaps, right? And in the context of listening, uh, if you roleplay, you may have felt this at least once or twice that a player may at one point or another participate in a scene with only their own perspective in mind. You might see that in the form of a character that might ignore the context of a scene or might enter it and disregard anything that's going on around them or just want to say their piece or whatever have you. This is a thing that happens, right? And if you think about those scenarios, and then think about how they happen, right? Think about what could potentially uh, counteract those. And a lot of times it is listening, right? The strength of the backline in improv is that while the performers are in the back, not within the scene, they are listening and watching everything that's going on stage. And they're tracking it. They're seeing what's going on and they are saying, okay, maybe I can do this as I come in to help amplify what's going on here. And then they do that, right? Because a big focus in this sort of format is effectively lifting the other performers and making the things that other people are doing look really cool and to heighten those. So it really gets felt when a player does participate for themselves. And if you have ever experienced that, I then urge you to think, how could this have happened differently? Is there something that could have been listened to or acted upon within this scenario that would have helped the situation? And then try to translate that to whatever it is you end up doing. That if you do think you're in a scene that like you want to do something very specific, and then you recognize that like mental block of I actually don't know if that actually fits what's happening here, then that mental clarity, let that set in, right? Let that mental clarity set in and then go through that mental process again. To run that same exact mental exercise of, okay, well, what is it that I am aiming for here? And is it congruent with the current direction and expectation of the setting? If it isn't, then start to listen a bit. Kind of sit back, listen to what's going on, and then enter. Because if you're in a scene, or if you're approaching a scene, you are effectively in that back line. You are a listener, right? So you don't want to be that person that acts for themselves, because everyone feels that. This is not avoidable. It is very much like there's the notion of like, animals can sense your feelings. People can sense your feelings too. If you're feeling down and you're in a conversation, you're just kind of like carrying yourself as usual. Like, people will feel that, right? Like, there's no way of avoiding like the intentions of a person or the feelings of a person in general conversation. And it's very similar in this circumstance when it feels like a player has not listened to a scenario. So like, once again, kind of sit back, be that listener for a bit, be on that back line. Even if you're in a scene, if you are not like actively like pushing something in the scene, you're basically on the back line, right? You're listening to what's going on, seeing what's happening, and then at some point, you know, you come back in. You're like, okay, now I've got a strong idea what was happening here, and now I can heighten it. Let's go, and then come back in. It's okay to take that time. You don't necessarily need to be talking all the time. It's not super necessary. I think the
I
only
think
go on.
I think this is something that people people can do and like have done. I've seen it done. But it once again, it kind of just I really do think that trust is the big aspect here. You remember there are no cats in the Empire. There are no cats in Valis. Uh,
Yeah,
right? That was not at all like we the GM team had zero say in that happening, right? And I mean, and I think kind of like the reason that worked for to I suppose for anybody who not know, in Worlds Apart we had some players establish that there are in fact no cats in the world, or at least in on the fantasy end of the world, just cats don't exist. Um, Now that's kind of like a fact, right? So that's not so much a theme, but that's kind of a fact. And I think the reason that like stuff like that tends to happen, um, I've seen kind of like funny stuff like that proliferate a bit more easily than anything else, because it feels like, I suppose in a sense, it feels like something that is of little consequence to the story, TM, air quotes, whatever. Um, Even though that is kind of like big, kind of like world sweeping, consequences on one hand, it's like, it's kind of obvious. It's like, oh, there are no cats. Um, only cat people. Um, that's kind of a thing where the moment that nobody questioned it because everybody kind of like knew what was going on. Um, and I think it would be really nice if that sort of proliferation of just like truths could happen with things that also aren't jokes, because that one is kind of a joke, right? And it was marked as something that was being come up with by virtue of it being kind of a silly joke. But I would extend that sort of like that sort of thing to other things, right? Kind of like things that do actually contribute to the themes of the stories that are being told.
right. I guess like I have this on my screen, so I'm gonna bring it up. Maybe at some point. I don't know if it's like super relevant here. I'll do it at some point. But yeah, certainly there's we can think of many of those points where something came up and it just became a truth that everyone understood
Mm-hmm.
because someone just kind of said, "Yeah, this is real, right? Does this, what do you mean cats? Like there's this whole conversation. I think I remember either I was there in character or I watched it that like uh it was a conversation with a cat can that was that like one of the UN was talking about cats, and people
So
were like, "What do you mean?"
it was specifically the origination was with cat food.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
it was like
it's just food.
the reason it happened is because like it was with Hanako's character. They were because she was pretending to be a cat or a cat person, and the UN were like, "Don't give her cat food. That's like an insult." And then she was like, "What do you mean it's an insult?" Yeah, or somebody was like, "What do you mean it's an insult?" Like we cat people, it's like we have like highly refined diets, and like that kind of turned into, well, there are no cats, so they have no concept of like it's not animal food, right? Like cat food in this context was like food that the cat can eat, and it's completely normal, like
Right,
so that was kind of the angle. Um but yeah, I don't know. Like it was in a sense kind of clearly a sort of joke, and I think it being a joke kind of makes it feel more safe. I think like I usually see these sorts of jokes catch on easier. These are things that are more easily able to be established without having to ask a GM for help.
right. Carl on number two says that whole bit was cursed and Konika was loving it. Yeah, she tends to love cursed bits, doesn't she? It's all for it. Um, yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think we can kind of start talking about like that sort of dissonance that can possibly come out of that, right? Because the alternative tends to be that maybe you do kind of look to establish this sort of thing, right? You look to say there are no cats in the empire, and then at some point you realize that you were unaware that someone else 5 episodes ago had talked about having a pet cat. What do in that situation, right? Because we are in these different scenes. We are not omniscient people. We're not omniscient beings. So it is possible to run around this misunderstanding of like trying to communicate different things. And if we are seeking to use frameworks instead of uh, enumerated realities, then we are actually opening the door quite a bit more to this sort of cognitive dissonance that we have to reconcile somehow.
So I actually disagree. Not in the sense that you're opening the door to this cognitive dissonance. I disagree that it's more. Um,
Okay.
and here's why. I don't think it's more because like it is not. It is literally not any easier for the GMs to do this. I suppose the only advantage that the GMs have is that you do kind of like have a smaller, more tight-knit team that presumably talks to each other, and so you can have a centralized repository of information. But that centralized repository of information, i.e., the lore, is going to be small. It's not even going to be close to the entire size of what an actual world is. Here's the reason: we didn't have any lore on whether or not there were cats in the world, right? Why would we, right? Like who in the world, right? Like it's like, and if somebody had asked us 5 episodes ago if there were any cats, right? Like if they ask one GM might be like yeah, and the other GM might be like no. It's I don't think the GMs have any easier of a job to catch all of those edge cases than players do. So to answer the question of well, what do you do? You do your best. That's the answer.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think those sorts of edge cases are like I don't think the GMs have any easier of a time doing it. In fact, like it's almost I think I would argue that it's GMs have a harder time doing it because you have less people, right? You have less people to do less work. And what you're going to end up with, right? If you absolutely don't want any cognitive dissonance ever, then you could have like a really small world and be like, okay, this stuff in the lore, these are the only things that exist and nothing else exists and you can't make up anything else, right? Um, so you could do that. Like you could absolutely do that. Um, and in certain role plays, it might even make sense to do that sort of thing if you want to have a very small role play. But like, I don't think that if you're going to have a role play in which improvisation plays a part, I don't think the GMs have an easier task of, you know, wrangling that improv than anyone else
Right.
in the role play.
We're all kind of in the same position of interpreting the reality and making some
Yeah.
sort of snap decision call on our own of whether the thing makes sense given what we understand. And we all interpret things
It's
differently.
it's the myth of once again it's kind of like that myth of omniscience, which is true, right? Once again, it's true in tabletop, right? In tabletop, you have the scenes that are happening like in front of everybody in the table, and you have whatever secret lore, right, is in the GM's binder. In a live action game, you're going to have, the secret lore in the GM's binder. You're going to have like the publicly available information, but you're going to have multiple scenes, and the GM can only see one scene at a time, just like everybody else. And so the majority of the information in the roleplay is unknown to the GMs, just like everyone else. Sure, if there is some secret lore, then yes, the GMs might know that and have a leg up on the players in that way. But like, it's really minor, right? Like, it's going to be that much more than the players, really. I think that's entirely a myth and kind of needs to be dispelled. Um,
Right. No, I totally agree that
yeah.
in a lot of ways the GMs are in functionally the same position as the players on whatever's
Yeah.
going on within a roleplay.
The once again the only advantage that you might have is like because it's centralized and you can probably more easily meet, you can probably more easily resolve like outside of the role play, you can probably more easily resolve these like conflicts by like making decisions rather than having 40 people kind of like arguing at each other of like what direction to go in. If you have your team of like 3 people, 4 people kind of like having a discussion about which way to go in is probably going to be more manageable, right? So like if a decision has to be made that is going to be shared amongst everybody, then the GM's having a final say in that context is useful. But
Mhm.
like, I don't think a decision has to be made on every single thing, right? Like, you don't need to have this top-down decision made on every single, little thing. Reserve that for the cases where you kind of do need to,
Right.
reserve that for.
The classic "Can I climb this tree?" Right? Like GMs don't need to decide that, right?
In fact,
Uh,
it's not that the GMs don't need to decide that. It's you have a better answer to that question than the GM.
yep.
You know better about your character whether or not they can climb this tree than the GMs do. You literally have a better answer to the question than the GMs have in that case.
Right. I'm gonna pan over to the chat here because there's a good comment that I want to expand upon. But I also want to thank everyone for paying their taxes. It's great. Uh, Colonel number 2 says
Woo.
hand wavy cat at time A was interpreted differently than cat at time B. Quote, because language is funny. I want to expand on a very important point there. It's the first 2 words, hand wavy, right? When talking about how to address the dissonant situation, right? You have recognized that there is a conflict in information that's presented in a setting. The art of figuring out how to reconcile that in character, the art of understanding how to dispel the conflict of information is incredibly useful. because that's a good example of it, right? You could say there was some kind of funny language barrier there because there's not even a word for cat in Worlds Apart. So you could very easily just say, well, you didn't understand the context right, and then explain what it actually meant to the first person, and then the second person's in line, and then everyone's in line, right? Figuring out where the two actually kind of meet together and figuring out um, how to not necessarily just hand wave, but be able to explain the context of the information in a way that makes sense and that both of them can make sense. That art of compromise, if you will, in improv is super, super, super important because this potential for dissonance of information is inevitable, right? There's always going to be introduced a risk of something developing on one side of the world and then something developing a different way on the other side that then meet together at some point because interpretations vary between people. No matter how much you want to thematically pull everything together, no matter how much we want to do that, no matter how good that setup is, people are different. They're going to say different things. Those different things might not agree with each other. And then in the end, you got to figure it out somehow. You got to talk about it. Like maybe you could the way you comment on it too. Once again, commenting on things as a character establishes something about the character, right? What if you use that as an opportunity to say the other character's crazy, right? Then you're casting aspersions as the character. You're evidencing that character is fine with like doing that, and suddenly there's growth, right? And everyone sees that, and it's cool. But there are just any number of ways to reconcile information to handwave or to find compromise with context, and that in particular is a really good skill to build for those very specific scenarios.
Yeah. I suppose here's the question, because the cat at time A versus cat at time B, I feel like that's actually a bit easier to deal with because if you have like two events that are like separated, then those like can kind of like exist like and you can kind of like resolve that outside the role play where like potentially, right? Like if it happens on like two different sessions, 2 different days, like that's something that's when you have time, it's usually easy to resolve stuff. But here was the kind of like the question that we started with today was about speed. Here's a hypothetical scenario for you,
Sure.
Solace. So let's say I am in a scene and the kind of like I've established that I have my pet cat, right? And I've had kind of like a heartwarming scene, or it's I have Mr. Fluffles, and I love him a lot, you know. And then later, right, kind of like next session, I'm in another scene, and in that scene, we have another player who has just established or has just said, there are no cats in the world.
Mm.
What do I do? And then what do they do? Let's kind of go through this like hypothetical scenario where because like theoretically we could call a GM, right? But like what if we don't want to, right? We're not going to call a GM. We're going to resolve this ourselves. How is this going to go down?
Yeah, I guess it depends on like how it happens, right? Like, are you in the same scene with the person, or is this like something that's
Yeah, no,
communicated?
you are there. You're in the scene with this person who has now just said, cats do not exist in this world. And they weren't with you in the previous scene where you were talking about your cat. But you are in both scenes. You established earlier that you have a cat, and now you're in a scene where it's just been established that cats don't exist.
Right. I mean, I think the language thing still applies in that you could effectively hand wave that it is a language barrier issue or a translation issue. It could also depending on the status of your character. Like Curlon number 2 says, could be a social class thing that um, maybe it is possible that the existence of cats is limited uh, to various people. Maybe this person that says cats don't exist could be in a reality where they don't, uh, based on their kind of worldview and perspective. Say, like for example, the deer can. Like if they in their completely closed, shut off worldview thought that cats don't exist, but they do exist everywhere else, then this would be a learning scenario for them. And this like very much depends on context, right? It depends on who's saying it and what information is being portrayed by saying it. If I, as Rowan, were to say that they don't exist in the same scene as the person that said they have a pet cat that they love very much, that would be very, very, very different than the other way around, right? And the way that resolves, I think, would be done very differently because it's very clear that different goals and different understandings of that information are presented by the different people presenting that information.
So I'm going to answer this question from an entirely different perspective because
Okay.
this is the I see that's what you're talking about, Solus, and I see what Kurlon is talking about in the chat. It's like, could cats be a rarity only some social classes have access to? Stuff like that is how it's like the particulars of like how to resolve the thing in the lore of the world, right? And I think that that's a useful skill to have. I think resolving this in the lore of the world is not the only thing I think that you should be thinking about.
Okay.
The first question that I would ask personally is why? You know, what were the purpose of these two scenes? What was the purpose of me having, the scene with my cat, and what is the purpose of this person saying that, cats aren't real? What are these scenes doing? And kind of communicating that to each other kind of mid-scene. Here's scenario number one, right? Scenario number one, perhaps I mentioned this cat thing kind of like as an offhand comment, and like, yes, we had a scene about it earlier, but it doesn't really feel important to my character. I could theoretically just like drop it and never bring it up again, and kind of like play into the bit and continue establishing that yes, cats don't exist in the world, and kind of like full force go and support that person, right, on making that the new reality, right? I could yield. That's like option one,
Mhm.
is like, I don't consider that very important, so I can like yield. Option number two is like, well, maybe I do consider this very important, right? Like this cat has featured in multiple scenes and it's been very emotional. It's kind of been it's a core of kind of how my character has come to be, right? And it would really kind of hurt my character um, for that to be a case. Um, at that point, right, I could kind of like start talking about, hey, I have a cat, I have a cat. His name is Fluffles. It's really nice, and kind of communicate that to my fellow players. I purposefully actually used kind of like a very kind of silly example here, of like, cats don't exist. I struggle to imagine a I struggle to imagine a world in which this fact is very important to a character in a way that it has also not been established in the world building, right? Um, the cats don't exist is definitely, I feel, was like my stand-in for like a offhand comment or like a joke that's kind of like being made on the spot. In that case, right, it would be kind of up to the other players to kind of like realize what's going on, and you could kind of trust them to, you know, work around it, like in the scene, right? You could say it's like, well, I have this cat, and this cat's really important to me. That's kind of a mean joke, and then you can kind of like figure that out, right? The details of like how it actually works in the lore is like I think less important than that negotiation. Now, if you end up in the situation, and this is, I guess, what my example doesn't cover, if you end up in the situation where you have two characters who have kind of like taken upon themselves like these have established these important facts that are core to their character that haven't been established kind of like in the world building, and they haven't talked about to anybody until now, and now they're finding out that these like core pieces of information to this character are conflicting. Well, in that case, kind of sucks, and you're going to have to and you're going to have to deal with that, the dissonance in one way or another, and it's probably not going to be nice. At that point, I feel like something has already failed. Like some community has already failed. You're probably going to need to like talk it out in full at a later time. Um, right? Like if it actually has to be, you know, one or the other, and it's like black or white. That feels very much like a reality is subjective thing, right? Like if you have something that's very core to your character and you haven't made it known, and you know you're just now making it known, you know, is it actually real? Um,
Right.
it
They,
might be a too bad situation, kind of in that time, right? But um, but yeah, I think what is important to think about is not just um like how do you solve this in character, right? It's more like, well, what are these people trying to do with their scenes? um
mhm.
I can communicate that. I can communicate my intent in character by talking about my cat and how important they are to me to my scene partners. And like if my scene partners are there and playing and playing to lift, they will understand what's going on and help resolve that issue, right? Um, so that's what I would do, is kind of consider what this piece of information means to me before, like the moment it becomes obvious that there is a contradiction, consider what that means to me before immediately bringing attention to it, right? Like you can wait a moment before bringing attention to the contradiction and consider like, what does it mean to me, and what do I want to communicate to my scene partners?
This is like one of those inherent difficulties with the fantasy genre, which we tend to use when doing role plays because it's, you know, another reality. We tend to push toward other realities. That, like, with the fantasy genre, it opens up the design space for reality, usually near infinitely. And we tend to try to manage that by pulling into specific types of genres, whether it's like dark fantasy or inspirations that we draw from. Um, Maybe looking at like, you know, different kinds of time periods or different kinds of technological inspirations or whatever have you, that I think those are how we try to manage that sort of over overly free design space that fantasy allows. But that's with that kind of freedom comes with, again, this potential of interpreting within that space in different ways. So in reality, um, I think both of the things can be true at the same time. That you can absolutely build the skills necessary to be able to make sense of the things at the time, while also having the consideration of what makes those things happen. Why did this player establish this kind of truth for their character? Are they using it as something that's important to their emotional growth? Or is it something that's maybe a bit that they want to push? Or is it, you know, whatever? Like these are how you kind of reconcile this information. And there are cases where it does become like a full head-on conflict of like two people are doing things that they think are important to their experience, and they realize those two things cannot exist in the same place at the same time, that's when you have those discussions, right? That's when you kind of have to reconcile, okay, this is not something that we can easily iron out, and that's okay, right? This is exactly what stuff like the debrief is for. That you can you don't necessarily have to full send continuously in the exact same way. You could like maybe change topics or whatever, and then just resolve it later, and that's totally fine. Um, but like again, you have the tools like the debrief to be able to have that space to say, you know, we both did these things. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out what's going on here and what we can like kind of conclude on. And then bam, you figured it out. Next episode, you're coming in with a common understanding. Doesn't matter which direction it goes. It's a shared responsibility.
Yeah. I had an idea which I was probably I don't have any plans on running like any like covert role plays anytime soon. Because like this is like an idea that was throwing around in my head during Worlds Apart, because speaking of covert role plays, and
Sure.
we had a lot of spies. A lot of people wanted to play spies. So I was kind of like throwing around in my head like some ideas of like how to deal with that. For example, kind of like truth in a role play where characters are lying, right? Gets a bit harder. And it's kind of like taking inspiration from like improv and a lot of like improv stuff. We often have like code words, like code phrases. I guess LARP has like LARP has like meta mechanics, but like I've done like sort of code words in improv where you kind of like mark certain things, like certain information for your scene partners. For example, for example, in some of the scenes that we were doing, for short form this time, not long form, if you're following the UCB kind of school of improv, the whole point of a scene is to find the game of the scene. The game is essentially the part of the scene that you're playing, and it's part of the scene that's supposed to be funny, right? I don't know. We Are Magic Cows could be the game of a scene. And is the game of a very specific scene that I'm thinking of right now. Because that was a scene in which we were practicing using the "so you're telling me that" code word. And kind of what we would do is, if one of us wanted to suggest a scene to our partner, we would say, or suggest a game to our partner, we would say, "So you're telling me that blank," and whatever's in the blank would become the game of the scene at that moment. It's phrased as a question, but it's actually declarative to your partner. It's like, well, this is the game of the scene now. And I was kind of flipping that around in my head of like, I'm imagining a role play where like, you do have characters that are lying, and it's like might be really hard to do this sort of like shared truth negotiation. I feel like it could be interesting to try out like code words for truth. Some like marker, some like truth marker, where you are telling your scene partners, "Hey, my character is telling the truth. Hey, my character is lying." I've wanted to try out a role play with some mechanic like that. I don't think all role plays are going to need that, but I've kind of been flipping that around in my head as like a potential thing.
Yeah, so definitely fit if it's like very much intended for the roleplay experience to be measuring and gathering information between each other, right? I think that would be like, I mean, if you've got your kind of spy network and various like interests against each other in Worlds Apart, That makes sense because that's like shared knowledge that everyone knows there's a bunch of spies and there's a bunch of people doing deals and shit. And then that becomes the understanding. So it makes sense to have those rules. Uh, if it's not
Heck,
deliberately
like
there, if it's not structured in, or if it's not like, if it players just don't have any sort of significant representation of that, then it's like, why bother, you know?
yeah, it's like heck, like a lie marker just feels super useful, right? Like if you're trying to be kind of like that, sneaky lying character, and you do it with a lie marker, that gives your scene partners the opportunity to, because like if you don't know that the person is supposed to be lying, you could just be like, "Huh, that's weird. Here's this piece of information that contradicts what you just said," and you like that you just like off the top of your head, right? You might do something like that. But if that information is being conveyed with a lie marker, right? Like as somebody's scene partner, if like somebody did like a lie to me, I could be like, "Huh, okay, they're lying. I can sit on this for like a session or two and then call them out on it, right?" Um,
Mm-hmm.
like that's something that it kind of gives you the ability to do, or like, or just like consider, right? It gives me the opportunity to consider what's appropriate for the current scene. That was just an example, I suppose, right? You could call them out immediately. You could, you could make that informed decision as to like, what do I feel is appropriate for this scene? Do I think it would be fun to like wait on it and be like more upset later, you know?
I think one
Um,
thing I can definitely push for in this scenario, I would say lie markers are certainly a very deliberate thing that would be like structured in. I, from the player perspective, would very, very heavily encourage everyone to, as their characters, be bad at the thing they're trying to do. It's so fun. It is so fun to like do something that takes effort and skill and attention to detail and then just miss some of that detail because not only is it fun to just have those little moments of like, if you're trying to lie like, I don't know what you're talking about, that wasn't me, that's, it's like, yeah, they're a bad liar or whatever, but then you get to play off that interesting bit of like, yeah, they're not perfect, right? No character is perfect, and you're playing on a bit of a flaw there that then gives other people more to work with. That means they can actually respond to it. That means they can build on it. And it means you have more to work with when that kind of comes back around. You give more to happen. That means you're going to experience more. And that's just more fun, right? It's just really fun to explore those kind of instances where we try to do something and it's not exceptionally the absolute best thing we can do, right? It's boring to be like super good at everything. It really is. Like the moment you start failing, the moment you start like having those like, if you're like maybe a logical thinker like me, I'm a very strategic person. I'm a very competitive, strategic, logical sort of person. That like I very often look for ways for my characters to be stupid as hell, right? Like put them in situations that are like very not reasonable to be in or to like make incorrect judgments about because it's fun to do that because it's fun to be wrong. That absolutely opens up space for other people to engage in those moments, especially when you're thinking about like secret keeping, right? If you're thinking about like truths and lies, because that communicates more to other players to uh, understand the intention of what you're doing. Even if you don't have the lie marker, making your character a bad liar means that sure, your character in the moment, you know what they're doing. As a player, listening in on the scenario, you know more about what the player is going for, or what they know what you are going for in that circumstance.
So I will expand on this. Don't just be a bad liar. Also, at the same time, also be bad at like detecting the truth.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
it is so the fun part I think isn't it, so fun part for me isn't necessarily like being bad at the thing that I'm doing in character. The fun part for me is when I'm there with my scene partner and like both of us know exactly what's up, right? Like out of character, both of us know exactly what's up. We know exactly what's going on, and like the characters are there, like playing out this drama. But both of us kind of know what's going on out of character, and we're like mentally high fiving each other for putting together this really cool scene, right? Um, but that's only possible if the players themselves know what's going on, right? This is kind of uh, the origin, or at least one of the kind of things of, characters tell secrets, players don't. This includes like during session, right? It's so much better if like you communicate your intention through like your out of character's intention through your character's actions very clearly. Because if you do that, if you're able to communicate your out of character intentions like through your character's actions, and other people kind of like catch on to that, you will be there, and then you'll basically, once again, you'll be able to do these like mental high fives with your scene partners who are, who are there for you, and you're kind of there to have fun with each other, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's like that's the part that I find the most fun is when personally it's not like it's not the being bad at the thing necessarily that's bad. Like, yeah, okay, like occasionally, I guess like making your character the butt of a joke can be amusing, but I guess what's even better than uh, I don't even want to say even better because like if you're constantly making your character the butt of the joke, um, that's a very specific type of character, right? That doesn't work for every character. So
Right.
like um
There's a give and take.
but that's not what that's not what being bad here in this context means. It is if you communicate your intentions loud and clear to your scene partners, right? If everybody knows what's going on out of character, then you have the necessary information to make those decisions about what happens in the scene. You can make those decisions together, and it really does turn into this like big game of teamwork, and it's just really satisfying, really rewarding to be in that.
Exactly. It opens up the space when you allow some room between your intentions and the character's actions. Right? Like if you that's kind of the space that we're looking for there is that you can communicate what you're going for without just doing the thing. Like I'm communicating that I'm lying by having my character maybe either not be as good of a liar or just really pushing an emphasis on the lie that I'm telling. And my goal as a player is to bring the other player into that reality. I'm trying to communicate this goal to them so they can play with me on that. I don't, as a player, ever want to be in a situation where I'm just trying to play something on my own and not trying to include the other person in it. In that case, even if it's something like a character against character sort of scenario, if there's a conflict, like the other player being involved in that is still generally just far better because then that they also have enough opportunity to heighten the situation for both of us. And that is where the teamwork comes in. And that's why we're on a football field.
Yeah.
I mean, we're the only ones out here. We kind of rented it out for ourselves, but
Yeah.
usually there's some teamwork going on this field in both directions.
I this is only tangentially related to this podcast, but I might actually have a video to show you after this.
Oh,
It's like a narrative improv performance. Um, we've had some good ones, we've had some bad ones. I suppose I'll show you the good one. We've had some really bad ones, ooh,
all right, fair enough.
where the teamwork was lacking. But yeah, that's a tangent. I think I'll do that after.
Sure.
So, because I was just like really thinking about that, like as we've been talking, I've just been like really thinking about like kind of the techniques that we learned for this like live negotiation. For those of you who don't know, like I do kind of like uh, improv with an improv group, Skits and Bits. Within that, we've had one lovely person who's hosted narrative improv, and like narrative improv in this context, improv, despite getting the there's like a reputation in improv where like you're making stuff up on the fly. This is absolutely not true. You're not making stuff up on the fly. Improv is very structured all the time. Usually, a long form improv usually has like very strong structures of like you do this, 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 and this in this order. Narrative improv is the sort of improv that kind of forgoes structure, in which we literally just like improvise a play from nothing but the title, and kind of just go for it. And the thing that made that work is all of us who were in this group had to essentially kind of like learn how stories work. And we did a lot of like looking into like different story structures, like fairy tales. There's like the 3-act structure, 5-act structure. There are different like types of story structures, and like those like those structures like really help. Having some sort of framework, whatever it is, right, that allows you to make decisions, right? It empowers you as the player to kind of like make decisions about what works and what doesn't work in the story, is going to be incredibly useful. In case of roleplay, it's usually the lore. And that's why I suggested that like the lore should be like a map of like what to do and what not to do. It's essentially like the lore should give you an idea about the sort of things that you can and can't bring up in the role play. Having some form of structure like that, literally anything that fills that niche is going to be great. Obviously, there are different forms of it, right? Like I just mentioned, like story structure. That's just pretty great to know. I actually really recommend it. It's helped legitimately helped my role playing to kind of like understand story structure. But of course, whatever it is, it just needs to be kind of like shared amongst all the players, right? There kind of needs to be a shared understanding of like what are we all using as this guide. And I guess that's where like the staff comes in. Like the staff can make that decision, the centralized decision on what you're going to be using as your guide.
Right. And the thing I wanted to bring up before that I feel is at least barely within context here, so I will, is one of the Jeep truths from Jeepform, which is actually a very large inspiration behind Couchform. You may have understood that from the titles of these schools of thought being very similar, but regardless, so the Jeep truths are effectively their kind of traditions or guidelines, very similar to how Couchform principles are very much guidelines for understanding roleplay and interpreted truths. Jeep's truth number 4 is that setting does not make up for story. Assume you are the only one that thinks your setting is cool. Which basically goes back to that point of writing things just to write them or just to add them because they are cool is fine, as long as you understand that should in some way tie back into the story and tie back into how the players interpret it. Because if you are the only one sitting there and saying, these are all these cool things that exist within this world, this is awesome, like this, everyone look at this, it's very often that you're going to be the one that's pushing that the most, right? You're going to be the one that is the most interested in the things you write, whether it is a world or a play or a character, right? I see a lot of players that will hone in and just talk about their characters over and over. And it's very often that this is the same case with characters, right? It's not everyone's necessarily looking at a character the exact same way. So then the thought process goes to what is important to communicate about this setting. And in a very similar vein, what's important to communicate about a character. And that's where it comes in that we share the truths of our characters and the setting by understanding what each other's goals are and what exactly we want to build thematically within this setting, which is where, again, that shared understanding comes in, that process of uh, being the organizer of a role play and saying, what kind of direction do we want this to go? Let's talk about what's the most important to us and build this sort of social contract. And that's like the consideration that I think is best to make, at least within this style of thematic roleplay. That this is the important consideration that we make as organizers and players, sharing that information with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, I'm looking at the schedule. Is there anything else you wanted to go over?
I feel like I've mostly kind of gotten to what I wanted to talk about.
Cool. Same here.
This feels like a topic done.
Yeah. I think this one did build off a lot of the other stuff that we talked about, so it was very easy to get over some of the bigger points. So that was good.
Yeah.
So
I'm not gonna go over time today. We
yeah,
over time last week, so we'll make up for it.
yeah. This time we got a short one, short-ish, relative. We talk a lot. All right. So while we do our outro here, y'all are free to funnel in whatever last-minute questions you have. But until then, this is On the Couch, the podcast where we talk about Couchform, which I have put in right there. It is a style of roleplay that focuses on building a core theme, designing to support themes, and playing to lift the scenarios within it. The Couchform core principles are what the School of Thought revolves around, which is that Google Doc link. And we are currently in a stage channel in the Myriad Discord server where we're going to probably hop over to the general channel and maybe watch this thing that Cyllin just mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very excited for that. So yeah, this informational podcast just talks about all these principles and what they mean and what kind of ideas have led up to them. And I think, God, we are getting real close to the end here. We're finally getting to the double digits next time. Oh boy. What do you think about that?
Nope, almost there.
Almost there.
Less
Next one's big. Oh my God. Next one's reality is subjective. Oh, okay.
Reality is subjective. Yeah, that's welcome to.
And welcome to early modern rationalism.
Strange reality.
We're going to be talking about monadology.
Yes. So this week we talked about why things are true. Next week we're talking about what is true. What is true? What is truth?
I'm not gonna lie.
I suppose we'll find out.
I actually believe this next principle, like outside of roleplay too. It's just like reality is subjective, you know. I actually had that conversation with one of my coworkers on an offsite. Anyways, that's what's gonna be the next podcast subject matter, right? So, Thank you all for being here. Thanks again, Cyllin. Podcast is fun. This has been On the Couch talking about the shared responsibility of truth. And next episode, we're going to be talking about principle number 10, reality is subjective, where we're going to talk about the point of view of everyone within the roleplay and what is truly real to them. All right. Take care, everyone. Dylan, this is where you say bye.
Bye.
Oh.